The Crusades, a series of religious wars, initiated, supported, and sometimes directed by the Latin Church in the medieval period. But the Crusaders were one of the most controversial warriors in history, whose main goal was the liberation of the Holy Land from the Muslims and the return of Jerusalem to the hands of the Christian world. But as we know, this was not the only thing that moved the minds of Christians. And today we will find out whether the Crusaders were really so religious and what events happened during the Crusades. Enjoy watching. I would like to tell you that it makes no sense to describe in detail all the Crusades, because in this way, the video would stretch for several hours. We will look only at the main moments of this time and find out the key events that influenced the world of that time. Officially, it is considered that there were 8 Crusades, but this is not entirely true. In fact, there were dozens of Crusades, and they were not always against Muslims, and not always in the Middle East. Let's start with, what was the cause of the Crusades? The rapid successes of Islam in the first century of its existence threatened a serious danger for European Christianity. The Arabs conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. The beginning of the 8th century was a critical moment. In the east, the Arabs conquered most of the Middle Eastern territories of Byzantium up to the borders of Asia Minor, and were already threatening this vital region for the empire. And in the west they tried to penetrate beyond the Pyrenees. The victories of Leo Issour and Charles Martel stopped the Arab expansion, and the further spread of Islam was stopped by the political disintegration of the Muslim world that began soon. The Caliphate was divided into parts that were at war with each other. In the second half of the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire even had the opportunity to recover something of what it had lost earlier. Nicephorus Phocas conquered Crete, part of Syria, and Antioch from the Arabs. In the 11th century, the situation changed again in favor of Muslims. The Byzantine throne after the death of Basil II was occupied by weak emperors, moreover, continuously replaced. The weakness of the supreme power turned out to be all the more dangerous for Byzantium, since just at that time the Eastern Empire began to face serious danger both in Europe and in Asia. In the Near East, the Seljuks made their offensive movement to the west. Byzantium's attempted confrontation in 1071 to suppress the Seljuks' sporadic raiding led to the defeat at the Battle of Manzikert. In the same year, Jerusalem was taken from the Fatimids by the Turkish warlord Atsiz, who seized most of Syria and Palestine as part of the expansion of the Seljuks throughout the Middle East. The Seljuk hold on the city resulting in pilgrims' reported difficulties and the oppression of Christians. The result was the First Crusade. Pope Urban II hosting the decisive Council of Piacenza and subsequent Council of Clermont in November 1095 that resulted in the mobilization of Western Europe to go to the Holy Land. Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, worried about the continued advances of the Seljuks, sent envoys to these councils asking Urban for aid against the invading Turks. Urban talked of the violence of Europe and the necessity of maintaining the peace of God, about helping Byzantium, about the crimes being committed against Christians in the East, and about a new kind of war, an armed pilgrimage, and of rewards in heaven, where remission of sins was offered to any who might die in the undertaking. The enthusiastic crowd responded with cries of Deus lo vult, God wills it. Immediately after Urban's proclamation, the French priest Peter the Hermit led thousands of mostly poor Christians out of Europe in what became known as the People's Crusade. In transit through Germany, these crusaders spawned German bands who massacred Jewish communities in what became known as the Rhineland massacres. They were destroyed in 1096 when the main body of crusaders was annihilated at the Battle of Sivta. In response to Urban's call, members of the high aristocracy from Europe took the cross. On the 7th of June 1099, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Many Crusaders wept upon seeing the city they had journeyed so long to reach. An initial attack on the city failed, and the siege of Jerusalem of 1099 became a stalemate, until they breached the walls on the 15th of July 1099. For 2 days the Crusaders massacred the inhabitants and pillaged the city. Jerusalem had been returned to Christian rule. Urban II died on the 29th of July 1099, 14 days after the fall of Jerusalem to the Crusaders, but before news of the event had reached Italy. At this point, most Crusaders considered their pilgrimage complete and returned to Europe. Godfrey was left with a small force, a mere 300 knights and 2,000 infantry to defend the kingdom. The Frankish position was enhanced by defeating an Egyptian relief force at the Battle of Ascalon in August 1099. The First Crusade thus ended successfully and resulted in the creation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusade of 1101 was initiated by Paschal II when he learned of the precarious position of the remaining forces in the Holy Land. The host consisted of 4 separate armies, sometimes regarded as a second wave following the First Crusade. The Crusaders faced their old enemy Kilij Arslan, and his Seljuk forces first met the Lombard and French contingents in August 1101 at the Battle of Mersavan, with the Crusader camp captured. The Nivernois contingent was decimated that same month at Heraclea, with nearly the entire force wiped out, except for the Count William and a few of his men. The Aquitanians and Bavarians reached Heraclea in September, where again the Crusaders were massacred. The Crusade of 1101 was a total disaster both militarily and politically, showing the Muslims that the Crusaders were not invincible. Also, between the First and Second Crusades, the Crusaders waged a constant struggle for power in the region, and often, not always with Muslims. Many attempts to capture overseas cities turned into miniature crusades of European countries, such as the Norwegian Crusade, the Venetian Crusade, and so on. However, in the subsequent period, the Arabs began to win back the lost territories. The fall of Edessa caused great consternation in Jerusalem and Western Europe, tempering the enthusiastic success of the First Crusade. Calls for a new crusade, the Second Crusade, were immediate, and was the first to be led by European kings. Concurrent campaigns as part of the Reconquista and Northern Crusades are also sometimes associated with this crusade. The aftermath of the crusade saw the Muslim world united around Saladin, leading to the fall of Jerusalem. Eugene III, recently elected pope, issued the bull Quantum Predecessors in December 1145, calling for a new crusade, one that would be more organized and centrally controlled than the first. The armies would be led by the strongest kings of Europe in a route that would be pre-planned. However, the Crusader troops were not united into a single army, what became the main mistake of the Europeans in this war. Also, a distinctive feature from the first campaign was the unwillingness of the Byzantines to help the Crusaders in the war with the Seljuks. French and German armies arrived at different times in the Holy Land, which made tactical organization extremely weak. The disastrous performance of this campaign in the Holy Land damaged the standing of the papacy, soured relations between the Christians of the kingdom and the West for many years, and encouraged the Muslims of Syria to even greater efforts to defeat the Franks. The dismal failures of this crusade then set the stage for the fall of Jerusalem, leading to the Third Crusade. In the first major encounter after the Second Crusade, Nur ad-Din forces then destroyed the Crusader army at the Battle of Anab on the 29th of June 1149. Then, after the death of Nur ad-Din, the Crusaders immediately had to deal with the threat posted by Saladin. As a result of his victory, much of Palestine quickly fell to Saladin. The siege of Jerusalem began on the 20th of September 1187, and the Holy City was surrendered to Saladin by Balian of Ibelin on the 2nd of October. According to some, on the 19th of October 1187, Urban III died upon hearing of the defeat. Jerusalem was once again in Muslim hands. Many in the kingdom fled to Tyre, and Saladin's subsequent attack at the siege of Tyre beginning in November 1187 was unsuccessful. The later siege of Safed in late 1188 completed Saladin's conquest of the Holy Land. The years following the founding of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were met with multiple disasters. The Second Crusade did not achieve its goals, and left the Muslim East in a stronger position with the rise of Saladin. A united Egypt, Syria led to the loss of Jerusalem itself, and Western Europe had no choice but to launch the Third Crusade, this time led by the kings of Europe. The news of the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Hattin and subsequent fall of Jerusalem gradually reached Western Europe. Urban III died shortly after hearing the news, and his successor Gregory VIII issued the bull Audita Tremendi on the 29th of October 1187 describing the events in the East, and urging all Christians to take up arms and go to the aid of those in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, calling for a new crusade to the Holy Land led by Frederick Barbarossa and Richard I of England. The armies coming from Western Europe pushed on through Anatolia, defeating the Turks and reaching as far as Cilician Armenia. On the 10th of June 1190, Frederick drowned near Silif Castle. His death caused several thousand German soldiers to leave the force and return home. The remaining German army moved under the command of the English and French forces that arrived shortly thereafter. Richard I and Philip II of France agreed to go on the crusade in January 1188. Arriving in the Holy Land, Richard led his support to the stalemated siege of Acre. The Muslim defenders surrendered on the 12th of July 1191. Richard remained in sole command of the Crusader force after the departure of Philip II on the 31st of July 1191. On the 20th of August 1191, Richard had the more than 2,000 prisoners beheaded at the so-called Massacre of Iadi. Saladin subsequently ordered the execution of his Christian prisoners in retaliation. Richard moved south, defeating Saladin's forces at the Battle of Arsuf on the 7th of September 1191. 3 days later, Richard took Jaffa, held by Saladin since 1187, and advanced inland towards Jerusalem. On the 12th of December 1191, Saladin disbanded the greater part of his army. Learning this, Richard pushed his army forward to within 12 miles from Jerusalem before retreating back to the coast. The Crusaders made another advance on Jerusalem, coming within sight of the city in June before being forced to retreat again. Hugh III of Burgundy, leader of the Franks, was adamant that a direct attack on Jerusalem should be made. This split the Crusader army into two factions, and neither was strong enough to achieve its objective. Without a united command, the army had little choice but to retreat back to the coast. On the 27th of July 1192, Saladin's army began the Battle of Jaffa, capturing the city. Richard's forces stormed Jaffa from the sea and the Muslims were driven from the city. Attempts to retake Jaffa failed and Saladin was forced to retreat. On the 2nd of September 1192, Richard and Saladin entered into the Treaty of Jaffa, providing that Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, while allowing unarmed Christian pilgrims and traders to freely visit the city. This treaty ended the Third Crusade. Well, the final important crusade for today is the fourth. In 1198, the recently elected Pope Innocent III announced a new crusade, organized by three Frenchmen, Theobald of Champagne, Louis of Blois, and Baldwin of Flanders. After Theobald's premature death, the Italian Boniface of Montferrat replaced him as the new commander of the campaign. They contracted with the Republic of Venice for the transportation of 30,000 crusaders at a cost of 85,000 marks. However, many chose other embarkation ports and only around 15,000 arrived in Venice. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, proposed that Venice would be repaid with the profits of future conquests, beginning with the seizure of the Christian city of Zara. Pope Innocent III's role was ambivalent. He only condemned the attack when the siege started. He withdrew his legate to disassociate from the attack but seemed to have accepted it as inevitable. Historians question whether for him, the papal desire to salvage the crusade may have outweighed the moral consideration of shedding Christian blood. The crusade was joined by King Philip of Swabia, who intended to use the crusade to install his exiled brother-in-law, Alexios IV Angelos, as emperor. This required the overthrow of Alexios III Angelos, the uncle of Alexios IV. Alexios IV offered the crusade 10,000 troops, 200,000 marks, and the reunion of the Greek Church with Rome if they toppled his uncle Emperor Alexios III. When the crusade entered Constantinople, Alexios III fled and was replaced by his nephew. The Greek resistance prompted Alexios IV to seek continued support from the crusade until he could fulfill his commitment. This ended with his murder in a violent anti-Latin revolt. The Crusaders were without ships, supplies, or food, leaving them with little option other than to take by force what Alexios had promised. The sack of Constantinople involved 3 days of pillaging churches and killing much of the Greek Orthodox Christian populace. While not unusual behavior for the time, contemporaries such as Innocent III and Ali ibn al-Athir saw it as an atrocity against centuries of classical and Christian civilization. Summing up the Crusades, we will find out that all the wars around the Holy Land were fought in no other way than for wealth and land. The capture of Jerusalem was only a pretext for the outbreak of hostility, but in fact the Pope wanted to stop the further advance of Muslims towards Europe. And the Europeans didn't care about Byzantium at all. As we can see, the Crusaders themselves were not good-natured, butchering entire cities. A huge crowd of fanatics blindly believing in the invincibility of their faith. Well, let's not forget that with the end of the Crusades, the Templar order formed in Palestine returned to Europe incredibly rich and influential. That's all for today. And of course there are other crusades that also influenced the course of history. But today I wanted to tell you about the most important key events that took place in this religious war. If you want to continue this topic, then write your opinion in the comments. Subscribe, and see you later. Goodbye.